In this lesson, we'll introduce bones and bone structure by taking a look at the function of the skeletal system as well as the methods of classifying bones. When we think of the skeletal system, we want to consider all the bones of the skeleton, of which there are 206 of them. The bones are associated with cartilages, so they're part of the skeletal system. Ligaments hold bones together, and there's even some connective tissues that are associated with the skeletal system. As an example, blood is a connective tissue, and it turns out that blood is actually made in the bone. So let's take a look at the primary functions of the skeletal system. The first function is support. Right? Think about our bones just supporting our entire body. Right? If we didn't have the skeletal system in there, the bones, we would be like a jellyfish and just wouldn't be able to move around on land. Another important function is that the skeletal system will store a variety of minerals and lipids. Right? The most prevalent mineral that you may have heard of is known as calcium. Right? But there's some other ones like magnesium and iron, but calcium is the one that we're going to look at a lot this semester. Right? And then some bones even store lipids, which are fat. Blood cell production. Our bones produce all of our blood cells, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, and even our platelets. So the bone is just a very active tissue as far as producing all of those cells. The skeletal system also forms as a protector. Right? If you think about the cranial vault, the brain is protected by these 8 cranial bones. Our heart and lungs are protected by the rib cage. Some of our pelvic organs are protected by the pelvic bones. So the skeletal system will protect a variety of organs. Finally, the skeletal system can act as levers. Right, here I put down leverage. Right, bones function as levers which allow for movements when our muscles contract. So our muscles are going to be attached to the bones. When the muscles contract, they're going to pull on the bones, which are acting as levers. Right, so the functions that I would like you to know are support, storage of minerals and lipids. All of our blood cells are made in the skeletal system. The skeletal system will protect certain organs, and finally it's going to act as a lever system for our muscles. So we're going to classify bones 3 different ways. The first method is classifying bones by shape. Then we're going to classify bones by structure. We're actually going to compare a long bone to a flat bone. And then finally, we'll classify bones by different bone markings that are on the bones. So let's take a look at the classification by shape first. All right, so it turns out that there's 6 different types of bone shapes. Right, so we'll take a look at sutural bones, irregular bones, short, flat, and long bones, and then we'll finish up with sesamoid bones. So the first one we have is a sutural bone. These used to be called wormian bones. You still do hear that term, but this is where they are. If you take a look at this skull picture right here, this is a posterior view of the cranium. This is the sagittal suture. This is the lambdoid suture. Right? These appear normal, but if you look on this left side, there's a bony island in the middle of the suture. That is the sutural bone. They can be anywhere. They're commonly found in the lambdoid suture back here. They can be found, towards the front where the coronal suture is. So they really can vary, and the amount of sutural bones that people have is also variable. Right? They don't have any real clinical significance. So we're going to call these sutural or wormian bones. Right? Where do you find them? In the sutures that hold the skull bones together. The second type of bone classification by shape is irregular bones. These are bones that have complex shapes. A great example here from our textbook. This is a vertebrae. You can see here's the body with the pedicles and the transverse processes, the articulating processes, the spinous processes. And it's got a very complex shape. If you've studied already the sphenoid bone, the ethmoid bone in the skull, the pelvic bones, the hip bones, right, the ilium, the ischium, and the pubic bone all together, they just have a complex shape. Short bones are more box-like. Think of them as being square or rectangular. And this happens to be a picture here of the carpal bones, which are forming our wrist. If you take a look over here, this bone right here is kind of box-like, right? Kind of rectangular. It's got flat surfaces. This bone over here also. There's no long shaft in the middle or anything like that. So these are considered short bones, right? The two great examples are the carpal bones that make up the wrist and the tarsal bones which make up our ankle or foot area. Now, a flat bone is a thin bone, right? It has two parallel surfaces running. If you take a look here, they took a section of the parietal bone, which is in the skull, and if we cut it and look at it from the side, you'll see like there's a thin layer of bone right here, and then there's a parallel bone running right along here also, and then there's a little bit of spongy bone in between. So flat bones, these are typically found in the bones of the skull, the sternum, which is the rib cage, the breastbone, our ribs, and then the shoulder blades, which are the scapula. Right? If you look at each one of these bones, they have a flat appearance to them. The bones that most of us think of is really, when they think of a bone, is a long bone. These are long and slender. So what you're going to see is, this happens to be the arm bone, the humerus. You're going to see a long kind of shaft, and then there's going to be one end expanded over here, and then if we go down to the other end, it's going to be expanded. So a lot of the bones in the arms, the legs, the palms, right, the feet, the fingers, the toes, even though these are actually small bones and that they're not really that long, they have these features. They have a shaft and then the two expanded ends. All right, so this is what we're going to classify as long bones. Finally, the last one is known as a sesamoid bone. These are interesting. These are bones that, if you want to highlight, they develop within tendons near joints, right? We find them around the knee, the hands, and the feet. They're typically small, round bones. They're a bit flat, but they're going to be found in the tendons, and their location is variable. But the one example that most of us would know is going to be the patella. Right? The patella is the flat bone right over here that's in the tendon of our quadricep muscles. This is kind of a group of muscles that run up here on top of the femur. So this bone is actually in the tendon of the quadriceps. All right, so here's just an overview slide. Again, the bone classification by shape: sutural bones, also known as wormian bones. Irregular bones have a complex shape. Short bones, just think of them as kind of boxy or rectangular. Flat bones, just like the name says, they're going to be flat. You're going to have two thin parallel bones running side by side like that. Long bones, here the key is you're going to have a kind of a thin middle area and then two expanded ends. You're going to have an expanded end over here and then an expanded end over here. And then finally, the sesamoid bones. Sesamoid bones are the bones that are found in the tendons, again, commonly the knees, the hands, and the feet. The second method that we can classify bones is by their internal structure. So the way we're going to do this, we're actually going to compare the anatomy of a long bone, right, which we just described, to the anatomy of a flat bone, right? They have two different types of internal structures. So I'm going to take you to a picture here. This actually happens to be a section of the femur that's been cut kind of in a frontal type of section, a coronal section. So if you take a look at this long part here of the femur bone, this is what typically people would call the shaft. But we're going to actually change the name to the diaphysis, right? So the diaphysis is the shaft of a long bone. Now, when you look at the shaft of the long bone, you're actually going to see two different types of bone. If you look out over here, there's a dense, thick, looks like it's very strong type of bone. This is what we call compact bone. Then inside the diaphysis, there's a canal right here called the medullary cavity, right? Or sometimes I even say the medullary canal. That's lined by a different bone. It's a more porous looking bone. You can see it up here a little bit. This is called spongy bone. So the diaphysis has two types of bone. It has the compact bone that's going to be on the outside, and look how thick it is. It's going to have a medullary cavity, and then lining the medullary cavity is a more porous type of bone called spongy bone. So let's go back to the note for a minute just to make sure we cover everything. All right, so if you want to just highlight, the diaphysis is what we would commonly call the shaft. It's primarily made up of a thick, compact bone, and then in the middle there's a medullary cavity. Some people call it the marrow cavity. And if you just want to add here, I didn't put it down, but that medullary cavity is lined by spongy bone. Right? The medullary cavity is lined by spongy bone. All right, so that's the diaphysis. Now, let's go back to the picture for a moment. Up over here, the expanded end proximally, and the other expanded end down over here distally, these expanded ends are known as the epiphysis, the epiphyses. So when you look at this, you'll see that the compact bone is here. It's just kind of thin. It's not nearly as thick as it was in the diaphysis. You can see it's starting to thin out as we get down over here, and then it becomes very thin. Right? It's still there. But the majority of the bone in the epiphyses, if you look in here, is a more porous bone. That is spongy bone in here. Same thing up here. If you take a look, all this kind of looks like a dry sponge. All of this is spongy bone, right? There's a thin layer of compact bone on the outside. And that gives it some strength. But this is the spongy bone in here. So the epiphyses has a thin layer of compact bone, but it's mostly made up of spongy bone, right? And then know that the epiphyses is always going to be the ends of the bone, right? It's the wide part at each end. The metathesis is the place where the epiphyses meets the diaphysis. If we look down over here, this was the epiphyses. Right, this was the diaphysis here. So this joining place right here is the metathesis. This is where our growth plate is located during our formative years, right? And then it eventually becomes bone. Here's the metathesis proximally, right? So wherever the epiphyses meets the diaphysis, that is going to be called the metathesis. All right, so just to go back to the note one more time to make sure we covered everything. All right, the diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. All right, it's primarily made up of compact bone. Within this diaphysis, there's going to be a canal called the medullary canal or the medullary cavity, and that, if you just add it down, again, is lined with some spongy bone. The epiphyses are the wide parts of the bone. They're going to be found at the ends, and they're predominantly made up of spongy bone with a thin layer of compact bone. And then where the growth plates are going to be located in the formative years, this is going to be called the metathesis. And again, the metathesis is the location of the growth plate during our growing years. So that was a picture from Martini. This is a picture from the Tortora textbook. So again, they have the same exact thing. You can see here the diaphysis, They show you the compact bone, right? They're showing you the medullary canal. It has some blood vessels inside there. Um, at the ends, they show the epiphyses, right? So this is the epiphyses right here. Proximal means closer to the joining part to the trunk. Distal is further away from the joining part of the trunk. So this would be the distal epiphyses over here. And then in between, this is the metathesis. Here's the metathesis up here. So here you could actually see this is where the growth plate was at one time. That line right there is where the growth plate was. All right, it's the same type of thing from the Tortora book. So let's compare the structure of a long bone, which we just did, to the structure of a flat bone. So here we're going to take the parietal bone as an example. So we take out a section of the parietal bone. The parietal bone is right over here actually. And if we take a section out of it, you're going to see there's going to be a thin layer of compact bone. And then there's a thin layer of compact bone over here. And then in the middle we have this porous bone, which is called spongy bone. So it kind of reminds me of a sandwich, right? If you had like a piece of bread here and a piece of bread here and then something in the middle right there, it's kind of like a sandwich. And that is the example of a flat bone. Notice, do you see a diaphysis? No. Do you see two epiphyses? No. Is there a metathesis? No. Is there a medullary canal? No. So it's very different than the structure of a long bone that we just took a look at. Okay, so again, a flat bone, just to make sure we cover the note, consists of spongy bone between two layers of compact bone. And we just want to add, right, just like a sandwich. Um, in the cranium, the layer of spongy bone, they actually have a term for it. You see it labeled here. This is called the diplo, but really it's just spongy bone between the compact bones. And just to kind of jump ahead a little bit, this is where we're going to see later in these presentations, this is where bone marrow is located, and this is where we make our blood cells. Finally, the last method of classifying bones is we're going to take a look at some of the surface features, some of the bone markings. We're going to see that there's various types of projections, various types of openings and depressions. So we'll take a look at those. Let's take a look at projections first. There's two types of projections. The first one is known as a process. Right? This is just a projection or a bump. So as an example here, as you study the bones of the skull in subsequent chapters, happens to be the zygomatic bone. You don't have to know the names of these right now, but this is the zygomatic bone, and there's a projection going backwards this way towards the temporal bone, right? And that would be the temporal process. A ramus is a part of a bone that forms an angle with the rest of the bone. So again, you don't have to know these specific bones yet, but this happens to be the body of the mandible, forming an angle, kind of almost the right angle going up. This bone right here is now the ramus of the mandible, right? Because it forms an angle with the body of the mandible right here. Right, so this is what we call a ramus. On this side, we have some openings in bones. Right? Some of our bones, especially the ones around the nose and the eyes right here, have these hollow cavities known as sinuses. So a sinus is a chamber within a bone. Right? Usually it's air filled. It helps us as far as the respiratory system, as far as humidifying and moisturizing air. A foramen is a really important word you need to know. A foramen is a hole, but it's typically rounded. Right? So if you take a look on the picture of the skull here, you see holes all over the place. There's a hole up here, right? There's a hole down over here. These are known as foramen. A fissure is also a hole, but it's more of a slit-like opening. So here, if you take a look here, this is a great picture. There's a slit-like opening in this bone here. Right, this is called the superior orbital fissure. Right? The reason we don't say foramen, a foramen is usually round. A fissure is going to be more slit-like. A meatus is a passage or a channel, right? We usually refer to it as the opening of a canal. So if you were to take a Q-tip and put it into your ear gently, right, the beginning part of our ear canal is a meatus. That is actually known as the external auditory meatus, right? So it's just the opening into a canal. And then finally, a canal is a duct or a channel. A lot of times blood vessels will travel through a duct or a channel, or a nerve will travel through it. So this is what we're going to call a canal. Let's go to depressions. So a groove, right? A narrow groove is known as a sulcus. Right? You can see there's a bump right here, there's a bump right here, and then there's a groove right in between. That would be called a sulcus, right? A lot of times blood vessels, nerves, tendons will sit in a sulcus. A fossa is a shallow depression. Kind of reminds me if you took a clamshell and opened up the clam and looked at the inside of the shell, it would have like a shallow depression. That is a fossa. I'll show you a good one up here. This happens to be called the iliac bone. Look at this shallow depression right here. It's kind of like the inside of a clamshell. This is called the iliac fossa. Now we have a lot of different fossas in the body. As you study the different bones, you'll see these fossa. All right, so those are the two depressions, a sulcus and a fossa. This middle column here are projections, and the job of these bumps and these projections here are to act as points of attachment for muscles and ligaments. So the first projection is known as a trochanter. This is only found on the femur. I put in your notes there, it's only found on the femur. So this big bump right here, this happens to be the greater trochanter, and there's another little bump over here. It's actually pretty big. It's called the lesser trochanter, right? We only find trochanters on the femur. No other bone would have it. A crest and a line. Let's do those together. They're both kind of the same thing to me. Those are a ridge of bone, except that a crest is more prominent, where a line is a more thinner lower ridge. Right, so a crest is a prominent ridge. So if you went to the top of your hip bone, there's a big thick crest right over here. It's called the iliac crest. Okay, where when a line would be, it would be like a thinner, like right over here. There's more of a raised area, but it's a line right there. That would be a lower ridge. All right, so think of a crest and a line as being the same thing. It's just that the crest is more prominent and the line is going to be lower. The next structure is called a tubercle. So this happens to be the arm bone, the humerus. There's a rounded, smooth kind of projection on part of the humerus here. Since it's rounded and smooth, it's not that big. They call it a tubercle. Compared to a tuberosity, usually a tuberosity is a little bit of a rougher projection. Sometimes students will use these interchangeably. It's sometimes hard to differentiate, but typically a tubercle is small and rounded, and usually to me it's smoother, and a tuberosity is just a rough projection. Right? So if we went to the middle of the diaphysis of the humerus, there's a rough projection out over here called the deltoid tuberosity. Finally, this column over here, these are parts of bones that are going to help to form joints. So we're always going to see these parts of the bone forming a joint within a joint. All right, the head of a bone is usually kind of a rounded area of the bone. So that's usually something that you can see. Most of the bones that have a head are rounded. Like this is the head of the femur. This is the head of the humerus. You can see it's kind of rounded. Just like we have a head, our neck is right below it. Right below the head is usually more of a constricted area. This would be the neck. Right, so since those two structures are always next to one another, right, you're always going to find the head and the neck near the joint or in a joint. A facet, if you just want to highlight on your notes, is a flat surface. Typically, facets are flat surfaces of a joint. So we have facets, we'll see on the vertebrae, we'll have facets on uh, the femur right here. This is where your patella bone actually will sit. There's a kind of a flat surface right over here. Condyles are smooth, rounded articular processes. So you can see over here is the humeral condyles. You can see they're kind of curved, smooth, rounded portions. And then a trochlea is usually a smooth, grooved articular process that looks like a pulley. A trochlea in Latin actually means a pulley, and something's going to pivot around it. So over here, one of our forearm bones, the ulna, will pivot around the trochlea. So these are the various bone markings. Again, we have 2 different projections, about 5 different openings, a couple different depressions, right? The projections where muscles and ligaments attach, and then we have projections that form joints. As you learn the different bones, right, these will become familiar to you.